It was a cold Tuesday evening in South Chicago when Officer James Mitchell's radio crackled with what seemed like just another routine call. The dispatcher's voice was calm but urgent. Domestic disturbance at 1247 Pine Street. James had handled hundreds of these calls during his 15 years on the force, but something about this one would change his life forever. The neighborhood was quiet as his patrol car pulled up to a worn-down two-story house. Paint peeled from the walls like old scabs, and the front yard was littered with forgotten toys. A jump rope, a deflated basketball, and a lone roller skate. The porch light flickered weakly, casting strange shadows across the crumbling concrete steps. As James approached the front door, he heard something that made him pause. Not the usual sounds of arguing or chaos he expected, but the soft whimpers of children trying their best to stay quiet. He knocked firmly, announcing himself as police. When no one answered, he tried the handle, finding it unlocked. The smell hit him first, a mix of unwashed dishes and something worse. The living room was dark except for the blue flicker of a TV with no sound. As his eyes adjusted, James saw them. 6 pairs of eyes watching him from a torn-up couch, like scared deer caught in headlights. "Is anyone else home?" he asked softly, trying not to frighten them further. The oldest girl, probably around 14, held a tiny one close to her chest. She shook her head, then pointed toward the kitchen. James found their mother there, unconscious on the linoleum floor, an empty pill bottle nearby. While radioing for an ambulance, he couldn't shake the image of those girls huddled together, protecting each other like tiny soldiers in a battle they never should have had to fight. Back in the living room, he began talking to them, not as a cop, but as a human being who cared. The oldest girl, still holding her baby sister, explained how they'd been taking care of themselves for weeks. She showed him their system, how they rationed the little food they had, how the 12-year-old twins took turns staying awake at night to watch over everyone, how the 9-year-old had learned to make sandwiches for school lunches when there was bread. As paramedics arrived to treat their mother, James noticed something remarkable about these sisters. Despite everything, they stayed together, moving as one unit. When the smallest one started crying, all 5 others reached out to comfort her automatically, like a well-rehearsed dance. The social worker arrived shortly after, talking about emergency placements and temporary homes. James watched the terror grow in their eyes at the words "separate homes." The oldest gripped her sister's hands tighter, trying to hold their world together as it crumbled around them. Standing there in that broken home, James felt something shift inside him. He'd seen plenty of tough situations in his career, but this was different. These girls weren't just another case, another report to file. They were 6 souls who needed more than just a temporary solution. Before he left that night, he learned their names, their ages, their favorite colors, and their dreams. The oldest wanted to be a doctor. The twins loved basketball. The middle one drew beautiful pictures, even on scraps of paper. The 6-year-old could already read better than most kids in her class. And the littlest one, she just wanted her sisters to smile again. That night, driving home to his quiet house, James couldn't stop thinking about them. He'd always thought his life was full enough. His job, his dog, his weekly dinners with his mom. But now his house felt too empty, too quiet. Those 6 girls, with their tight grip on each other and their desperate hope for something better, had shown him what family really meant. He didn't know it yet, but that routine call would be his last ordinary day as a single man. Sometimes the biggest changes in life don't announce themselves with fanfare. They creep in quietly, tugging at your heart until you can't ignore them anymore. 3 days after meeting the 6 sisters, James couldn't get them out of his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw their faces. During his morning coffee, he wondered if they had breakfast. While driving his patrol route, he kept thinking about the oldest sister's protective stance, standing like a tiny mother hen guarding her chicks. He visited them at the emergency children's shelter where they were temporarily staying. The place was clean and the staff kind, but it wasn't a home. The sisters shared 2 rooms, already knowing their time together might be running out. When James walked in, the littlest one ran to him, wrapping her arms around his legs like she'd known him forever. "Officer James," she squealed, her beaded braids bouncing. The other sisters watched carefully, hope and caution mixing in their eyes. They'd learned the hard way not to trust too quickly, but something about this police officer felt different. That evening, James sat in his car outside the shelter for almost an hour, thinking hard. His house had 3 bedrooms and a finished basement. His savings account was healthy after 15 years on the force. His mother, just 20 minutes away, had been nagging him about giving her grandchildren for years. But this wasn't about logistics. It was about changing 6 lives, including his own. He started making calls the next morning. His first stop was his mother's house, where he nervously explained his thoughts over her famous apple pie. "You want to do what?" she asked, nearly dropping her coffee cup. "I want to foster them, Mom. All 6 of them." Instead of calling him crazy, she surprised him by wiping her eyes with her apron. "Well, it's about time you gave me some grandbabies to spoil," she said, already planning how to renovate his spare rooms. The next few weeks became a whirlwind of paperwork, background checks, and home studies. His fellow officers thought he'd lost his mind. 6 kids, all at once. His partner asked during patrol, "You've never even had a goldfish." But James stayed focused. He took parenting classes, learned about trauma-informed care, and spent hours researching how to care for Black children's hair and skin. He joined online groups for transracial adoptive parents, soaking up advice like a sponge. His house transformed bit by bit. The man cave became a bedroom with bunk beds. His home office turned into a homework station with 6 different colored desks. The bathroom cabinet filled with hair products he couldn't pronounce but diligently learned to use. The social workers were skeptical at first. A single white male police officer wanting to foster 6 Black sisters. It raised eyebrows. But James' determination won them over. He showed up to every meeting with detailed plans, questions about cultural competency, and a genuine desire to learn. "Why all 6? One social worker asked during a home study. It would be easier to start with 1 or 2. James remembered how the sisters moved as one unit in that broken-down house, how they functioned like a single organism. "They're not a package deal you can split up," he explained. "They're each other's whole world. Breaking them apart would break their hearts." His mother jumped in full force, joining him at meetings and helping prepare the house. She learned to braid hair from YouTube videos and filled his freezer with home-cooked meals. His sister, a teacher 2 towns over, offered to help with homework and summer activities. One evening, as James assembled the last of 6 identical white dressers, each to be painted in the girl's chosen color, his neighbor stopped by with a casserole and raised eyebrows. "You're really doing this?" she asked, looking around at the transformed house. James paused, remembering the oldest sister's fierce protectiveness, the twins' quiet strength, the middle sister's gentle spirit, the 6-year-old's bright curiosity, and the littlest one's trusting hugs. "No," he said, tightening the last screw. "I'm not just doing this. I'm becoming who I'm supposed to be." He looked around at the chaos of his once quiet house, the pink and purple walls, the stack of school supplies, the collection of hair accessories on every surface, and felt more certain than ever. Sometimes the biggest changes in life aren't changes at all. They're actually moments of becoming who you were always meant to be. For James, fostering these 6 sisters wasn't just a decision. It was answering a call he didn't even know he'd been waiting for. The first morning with all 6 sisters under his roof felt like beautiful chaos. James had faced armed suspects and high-speed chases, but nothing prepared him for getting 6 girls ready for school. The bathroom line stretched down the hallway, and the kitchen looked like a breakfast tornado had hit it. "I can't find my blue notebook," shouted one of the twins, rushing past with only one shoe on. "Who took my hairbrush?" called another voice from upstairs. The oldest sister tried helping the littlest one with her cereal while simultaneously ironing her own school uniform. James stood in the middle of it all, holding 6 different packed lunches, each labeled with careful attention to who didn't like mayo and who was allergic to peanuts. That first week taught him more than his entire police academy training. He learned that the twins couldn't sleep unless their beds were arranged exactly the same way. The 9-year-old needed her toast cut into perfect triangles, or breakfast became a teary affair. The 6-year-old could only fall asleep if someone read her exactly 2 stories, no more, no less. His neighbors watched with a mix of curiosity and judgment as he struggled to learn how to do 6 different hairstyles. One morning, after his 3rd failed attempt at cornrows, the little one patted his hand and said, "It's okay, Officer James. You're getting better." Her sweet encouragement nearly brought tears to his eyes. The girls had their own adjustments to make. They weren't used to regular meals or having their own beds. The first time James took them grocery shopping, they stood frozen in the cereal aisle, overwhelmed by choices. They'd never been allowed to pick their own cereals before. "Really, we can each get our own box?" the 6-year-old asked, her eyes wide as saucers. James watched as they carefully selected their cereals, treating each box like precious treasure. Some challenges were harder than others. The oldest sister struggled to stop being the mother figure. James would often find her up late, checking on her sisters even though they were safe in their beds. "I've got this, watch," he'd tell her gently. "You just focus on being 14. The community's reaction was mixed. At the girls' schools, some teachers watched James extra carefully during parent-teacher meetings. At the grocery store, people would stare at the unusual family, some smiling, others whispering behind their hands. One day at the park, another parent asked loudly, "Are they all yours?" Before James could answer, the littlest one proudly announced, "Yes, he's our Officer James." Her simple declaration made everything else fade away. His fellow officers stepped up in unexpected ways. His partner started bringing over his wife's homemade cookies. The police chief's wife, a retired teacher, offered free tutoring. Even the grumpy old desk sergeant showed up one weekend with 6 perfectly sized bikes he'd fixed up himself. Bedtime routines became sacred in their house. James learned each girl's preference, the right stuffed animal, the perfect nightlight brightness, the exact number of goodnight kisses. Some nights, when everyone was finally asleep, he'd stand in the hallway, listening to the peaceful breathing from 6 different rooms, amazed at how quickly these girls had become his whole world. The hardest moments often came unexpectedly, like when the 9-year-old had a nightmare about their old house, or when the twins got into a fight at school because someone made fun of their white cop dad. Each challenge taught James something new about patience, love, and the real meaning of family. His mother became their saving grace, showing up with home-cooked meals and endless patience for teaching James the basics of raising girls. "You're doing good," she'd tell him, watching him brush the littlest one's teeth while helping another with homework. "These girls hit the lottery with you." But James knew the truth. He was the lucky one. Every morning, despite the chaos and challenges, despite the stares and whispers, despite the endless laundry and homework help and hair disasters, he felt more alive than ever before. His house was no longer just a house. It was alive with giggles, arguments, music, and love. One evening, as he sat surrounded by homework assignments and half-braided hair, the oldest sister looked at him differently. "You're really not going anywhere, are you?" she asked quietly. "Not a chance," he replied, tangled in what was supposed to be a simple braid. "We're family now." And in that moment, amid the beautiful mess of their new life together, James knew that sometimes the biggest acts of love come wrapped in the smallest, most ordinary moments, like learning to braid hair, making 6 different sandwiches, or simply being there, day after day, proving that family isn't about matching skin colors or perfect skills. It's about hearts that choose to be together. Trust doesn't come easy when life has taught you to expect goodbyes. The oldest sister knew this better than most. While her younger sisters quickly warmed to their new life with James, she kept one foot firmly planted in their old world, ready to grab her sisters and run if things went wrong. Every night, she quietly checked the kitchen cabinets, counting cereal boxes and bread slices, old habits from when food wasn't guaranteed. James noticed but didn't say anything. Instead, he started leaving little notes by the snack drawer, plenty more in the pantry, or made sure to buy your favorite crackers. One evening, while the younger girls were watching TV, James found her in the kitchen, making 6 lunch bags for the next day. "I can do that," he said gently. "I've always done it," she replied, not looking up from her sandwich-making assembly line. "I know," James said, pulling up a chair. "You've been amazing at taking care of your sisters, but you deserve to be taken care of too." She paused, knife hovering over a peanut butter jar. "What if you change your mind about us?" The question hung in the air like a heavy cloud. James had been expecting it, but it still hurt to hear. He thought carefully before answering. "Want to know a secret?" he asked, reaching for another slice of bread. "Every morning when I wake up, I panic for a split second, worried that all of this has been a dream. That my quiet, lonely house is still quiet and lonely. Then I hear someone arguing about bathroom time or the twins discussing their basketball plays, and I realize, this is real. This is better than any life I had before." For the first time, she looked at him directly, searching his face for any sign of dishonesty. Instead of words, James pulled out his phone and showed her something he'd been working on. A wall calendar app with everyone's activities color-coded. Basketball practices, dance classes, doctor appointments, school events. 6 different colors, 6 different lives, all carefully planned and accounted for. "See this?" He pointed to a Saturday marked in red. "That's your art show next month." And here, he scrolled to another date. "That's the Twins' championship game. And this is your sister's dance recital." A small smile crept onto her face as she watched him navigate through months of planned future moments. It was the first real smile he'd seen from her. The younger sisters adapted more easily. The littlest one had started calling him Daddy within weeks. The twins included him in their secret handshakes, and the 9-year-old proudly showed him every art project. But the oldest sister kept watching, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Change came in small moments, like when she got sick at school, and James left work immediately to pick her up, or when she mentioned liking a certain book series, and the next day found the whole collection on her desk, or when she had a nightmare, and instead of handling it alone, she found herself walking to James's room, where he was already awake, making hot chocolate. One particularly rough night, after the younger girls were asleep, she broke down. Years of being the strong one, of holding everything together, came pouring out. James just sat with her, offering tissues and understanding. "You know," he said after she'd calmed down, "being strong doesn't mean you can't lean on someone else sometimes. That's what family is for." "But we're not really your family," she whispered. James looked at the wall of photos he'd been building. Pictures of school events, birthday parties, ordinary moments of their new life together. "Family isn't about blood," he said. "It's about who shows up, who stays, who makes you feel safe. It's about choosing each other every day." That night marked a turning point. The next morning, for the first time, she let James make the school lunches. Instead, she sat at the kitchen counter, telling him about a project she was excited about at school. It wasn't a dramatic change, but in that simple moment of sharing breakfast and conversation, something shifted. Trust, they were both learning, isn't built in grand gestures. It's built in small moments, in kept promises, in showing up, in midnight hot chocolate and morning sandwiches. It's built in the quiet spaces between words, in the consistent proof that love doesn't always walk away. Just when things were falling into place, the letter arrived. James found it in the mailbox on a sunny Thursday afternoon, mixed in with bills and grocery store flyers. An aunt they'd never heard of was claiming rights to the girls. The paper trembled slightly in his hands as he read it again and again. He waited until after dinner to break the news. The girls were sprawled across the living room doing homework. The twins practicing math problems, the little one coloring, the others working on various assignments. The sound of pencils scratching paper and quiet giggles filled the room. "Family meeting," he said softly, his heart heavy. 6 heads looked up at once. The oldest sister noticed his expression first. She'd gotten good at reading him over the past months. "What's wrong?" she asked, already sitting up straighter, ready to protect her siblings. James explained about the aunt as simply as he could. She lived in another state, had just learned about their situation, and wanted custody. The room went completely silent. Even the littlest one stopped humming her usual bedtime song. "But we don't know her," one of the twins whispered. "She's blood family," James explained gently, though each word felt like sand in his mouth. The 6-year-old burst into tears first. "I don't want to go. You're our family now." She ran to James, wrapping her arms around his waist. One by one, the younger girls joined the hug, creating a tight circle of fear and love. The oldest sister stood apart, her face unreadable. "Do we have to choose?" she finally asked. That question launched weeks of uncertainty. Social workers visited again. Lawyers called. The aunt flew in from out of state. She seemed nice enough. Brought presents for all the girls, had photos of relatives they'd never met, promised them connections to their heritage that James couldn't provide. But the girls had changed in their months with James. They'd learned what stability felt like. They knew what it meant to have someone show up, really show up, every single day. The little one cried every night, worried she'd wake up in a strange place. The twins' grades started slipping. The 9-year-old stopped drawing altogether. Even the usually chatty 6-year-old grew quiet. One evening, James overheard the older girls talking in their room. "She's our real aunt," one twin said uncertainly. "Officer James is our real dad," the other twin replied firmly. "Maybe not by blood, but by love." The court meetings were hard. James sat there in his best suit, listening to people debate what was best for the children, as if they were talking about abstract concepts rather than 6 very real girls who had already lost too much. The aunt argued about cultural heritage, blood ties, family connections, all valid points that kept James awake at night. Was he being selfish, wanting to keep them? Could he really provide everything they needed? But then he'd come home to find little notes left around the house. "We love you," Officer James scribbled in crayon. Stick figure family drawings showing 7 people holding hands. Secret messages slipped under his door at night. The girls themselves started speaking up. The oldest sister, who had been so hesitant to trust, stood before the judge and spoke from her heart. "I know about blood family," she said, her voice steady. "But I also know about chosen family. Officer James chose us when nobody else did. He learned to do our hair, even though he was terrible at first. He comes to every school event. He knows how we like our sandwiches cut and which nightlight goes in which room. He's not just taking care of us, he's loving us." The aunt listened to all this with tears in her eyes. After court one day, she pulled James aside. "I came here thinking I was doing the right thing," she said quietly. "But watching you with them, they're not just being housed with you. They're blooming." The waiting was the hardest part. Every day felt like walking on eggshells. James kept their routine as normal as possible, still making lunches, checking homework, braiding hair. He wanted to promise them they'd stay together, but he'd learned in his years as a police officer never to make promises he couldn't guarantee. Instead, he loved them harder. He played extra board games, made their favorite meals, sat up late talking about their hopes and fears. If these were their last days together, he wanted them filled with as much love as possible. Through it all, their makeshift family grew stronger. The community rallied around them. Teachers wrote letters of support. Neighbors testified about the positive changes they'd seen. Even the grumpy old mail carrier spoke up about how the girls' laughter had brightened the whole street. Sometimes the biggest storms show us what we're made of. For James and his girls, this challenge wasn't just about custody. Something beautiful happens when a community decides to open its heart. It started small, with Mrs. Chen from the corner house bringing over traditional Chinese dumplings one evening. Every child should taste different foods, she said, showing the girls how to hold their chopsticks properly. The next day, Mrs. Washington from 3 doors down appeared with her hair supplies. As a beautician, she couldn't bear watching James's well-meaning but clumsy attempts at hair care anymore. She set up what the girls called hair school in their kitchen every Sunday afternoon. Hold the brush like this, she'd instruct James patiently, guiding his hands through proper parting techniques. See how the little one's hair curls differently than her sister's. Each crown needs its own special care. Word spread through the neighborhood, then the town. The story of the white police officer and his 6 black daughters touched something in people's hearts. But it wasn't just about their differences, it was about their love. The local news picked up their story after the twins' basketball game. James had shown up in a custom-made shirt with both their jersey numbers on it, cheering louder than any other parent. The reporter was there for the game, but stayed for the story of how this unlikely family was changing their community's perspective on what family could look like. James's fellow officers transformed too. The same cops who'd raised eyebrows at his decision now competed to be favorite uncle. Officer Rodriguez started a college fund. Officer Chen taught the girls self-defense classes. The police chief's wife organized a monthly mentorship program, connecting the girls with successful women of color in their community. The school principal, who'd initially been concerned about the arrangement, became one of their strongest supporters. She watched how the girls flourished under James's care, their grades improving, their confidence growing. She started a diversity and inclusion program, using their family story as an example of how love transcends boundaries. Local black mothers formed what they jokingly called the Cultural Committee. They invited James and the girls to Sunday dinners, church services, and community events. These girls need to know their heritage, one mother explained, and you need to know it too. James threw himself into learning. He attended cultural events, read books about Black history, and learned to cook soul food from YouTube videos. His first attempt at sweet potato pie was a disaster, but the girls ate every bite, touched by his effort to connect with their culture. The 6-year-old's class did a project about different kinds of families. She proudly stood up and explained how her family wasn't made by matching colors, but by matching hearts. Her teacher later told James she'd never seen such a beautiful definition of family. The local library started a book club featuring diverse family stories. The girls became minor celebrities, with other kids asking for playdates not because they were curious about their unusual family, but because they were fun to be around. Even the grocery store became a place of community. The checkout lady who'd once stared now saved coupons for them. Growing girls need good food, she'd say, slipping extra discounts their way. The butcher learned all their names and favorite cuts of meat. The baker would sneak an extra cookie into their bag with a wink. One day, the oldest sister came home from school upset. A classmate had made a comment about their family being weird. Before James could respond, their elderly neighbor, Mr. Peterson, who was fixing their fence, spoke up. "You know what's weird," he said, putting down his hammer. "People who think love has rules. Your family might look different, but it's the realest family I've ever seen." The girls started a blog about their life, sharing stories about their daily adventures. It wasn't just about being a transracial family. It was about how to braid hair while solving math problems, how to manage basketball practice and dance recitals, how to make 6 different lunches in record time. The community changed too. Other families started talking more openly about race, adoption, and what makes a family. The annual town festival added a family diversity day. People began to see that different didn't mean wrong. It just meant different. During that year's Halloween, When all 6 girls dressed as superheroes and James wore a cape that said, "Super Dad," nobody stared or whispered. Instead, neighbors called out greetings, complimented costumes, and treated them like what they were, just another family on their evening rounds. That's the thing about love. It has a way of spreading, of changing minds and opening hearts. In trying to build a family, James and his girls had helped build something even bigger. A community that learned to see with their hearts instead of their eyes. The courthouse looked bigger than usual on the morning of their first hearing. James straightened his tie for the 100th time, trying to stay calm for the girls. They sat in the waiting area, all 6 of them dressed in their best clothes, holding hands like a chain of paper dolls. "Remember," James said softly, "just tell the truth. That's all anyone can ask of you." The little one clutched her favorite stuffed rabbit, the one James had bought her on their first shopping trip together. "Will the judge be scary?" she whispered. "She's just a person who wants to make sure you're all safe and happy," James replied, though his own heart was racing. Their lawyer, Mrs. Thompson, had prepared them well. She was a kind woman who specialized in adoption cases and had taken their case to heart. "This isn't just about legal rights," she'd explained. "It's about showing the court what's best for these children." Inside the courtroom, James watched as person after person took the stand. Their teachers talked about improved grades and participation. The school counselor described how the girls' nightmares had decreased. Their doctor noted better health and nutrition. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Questions came up that made James's stomach twist. "How will you ensure these girls maintain their cultural identity?" one attorney asked. James spoke from his heart. He described the Sunday cooking lessons with neighborhood moms, the history books they read together, the Black mentorship program they joined. He talked about their visits to cultural festivals and how he'd learned to do their hair properly. "I can't give them everything their biological parents could," he admitted, "but I can make sure they grow up proud of who they are, connected to their culture, and knowing they're loved completely." The twins testified next, holding hands as they walked to the stand. They talked about basketball games with James cheering in the stands, about family movie nights where everyone got to pick a film, about how he'd learned each of their favorite meals. "He's not trying to change us," one twin said firmly. "He's helping us be ourselves." The 9-year-old brought her art portfolio, showing the judge drawings of their family, crayon illustrations of 7 stick figures with different skin colors, but the same big smiles. "That's us," she explained simply. "We don't match on the outside, but we match where it matters." Even the school principal came to testify. She described how James attended every parent-teacher conference, how he volunteered at school events, how he'd helped start a diversity committee. "In 20 years of education," she said, "I've rarely seen a parent so dedicated to their children's well-being." But the most powerful moment came when the oldest sister took the stand. She'd been the hardest to convince, the most protective of her siblings, the most skeptical of change. Now she sat straight and spoke clear. "Before Officer James," she began, "I was everybody's mother. I had to be. I made sure they ate, did homework, got to school. I couldn't be a kid because I was too busy being their parent." She paused, wiping a tear. "Now I can just be their sister. I can worry about my own grades. I can join clubs. I can have friends over. Officer James didn't just give us a home. He gave me back my childhood." The court-appointed child advocate asked about their cultural needs. "Doesn't a child need parents who look like them?" The oldest sister looked straight at James. "We need parents who love us, who show up, who learn and grow with us. Officer James might not look like us, but he sees us, really sees us, and he helps us see ourselves." Throughout the proceedings, their aunt sat quietly, watching. She saw how the girls gravitated toward James during breaks, how naturally they fit together, how they'd become a real family. Days turned into weeks of hearings. James kept their routine as normal as possible, still making breakfasts, checking homework, attending school events. But at night, after the girls were asleep, he'd sit in his kitchen, surrounded by their artwork and school papers, praying he'd done enough. Their lawyer reminded them that transracial adoption cases could be complicated. "The court has to be absolutely sure this is in the girl's best interest," she explained. "They're not just looking at love. They're looking at cultural competency, community support, long-term stability." But as the proceedings continued, something became clear to everyone in that courtroom. This wasn't just about a white police officer wanting to adopt 6 black girls. This was about 6 children who had found their home, their safety, their chance to just be kids again. This was about a man who had opened not just his house, but his heart, learning and growing and changing right along with his daughters. In the end, it wasn't just about what James could give the girls. It was about what they had. The day of the final decision arrived with the first snow of winter. The girls had spent the morning watching snowflakes through the courthouse windows, trying to distract themselves from what was about to happen. James had made their favorite breakfast, chocolate chip pancakes shaped like hearts, but nobody had eaten much. "All rise," the bailiff announced as the judge entered the courtroom. James felt 6 pairs of hands grip his arms, his hands, his jacket. They had faced this moment together, and together they would hear their fate. The judge, a woman with kind eyes and gray hair, looked at each of them before speaking. She'd spent weeks hearing testimony, reviewing documents, and considering what was best for these 6 sisters. "Family court," she began, "is often about difficult decisions, but sometimes, very rarely, we get to be part of something extraordinary." She smiled, looking directly at the girls. "I've been a judge for 20 years, and I've never seen a family quite like yours." The littlest one couldn't contain herself. "Are we staying with our daddy?" she burst out, then quickly covered her mouth with both hands. A gentle laugh rippled through the courtroom. "Let me read my decision," the judge continued, her eyes twinkling. "After careful consideration of all evidence presented, taking into account the best interests of these 6 children, their emotional bonds, their stability, and their future well-being." James held his breath. The oldest sister squeezed his hand so tight it almost hurt. "I hereby grant the adoption petition of Officer James Mitchell for all 6 sisters." The courtroom erupted. The little one jumped straight into James's arms. The twins hugged each other, crying and laughing at the same time. The 9-year-old started doing her happy dance right there in the courtroom. The 6-year-old ran to hug the judge, who looked surprised but pleased. But it was the oldest sister's reaction that touched everyone's heart. She stood perfectly still for a moment, tears streaming down her face. Then she turned to James and said the words he'd been waiting months to hear. "Dad, can we go home now?" Their aunt, who had been sitting quietly in the back, came forward. Instead of anger or disappointment, she wore a warm smile. "I came here thinking I knew what was best," she said, hugging each girl. "But love proved me wrong. You've got a good daddy here." She turned to James. "I'd like to be part of their lives, if you'll let me. They should know their extended family too." "Of course," James replied instantly. "The more people who love them, the better." The judge asked each girl to come forward and sign their new birth certificates. One by one, they wrote their names, adding Mitchell at the end. The oldest sister took the longest, tracing each letter carefully, as if making sure it was real. Their lawyer, Mrs. Thompson, handed out tissues as their social worker took photos. Even the tough bailiff was wiping his eyes. This wasn't just any adoption. This was proof that love could build bridges across any divide. Outside the courthouse, snow was falling harder. Their whole support system had showed up. James's fellow officers, their teachers, neighbors, the moms who'd taught James about hair care, even Mr. Peterson who'd fixed their fence. "Party at our house," the twins announced, and everyone cheered. Nobody seemed to mind the snow. Mrs. Chen appeared with dumplings. Mrs. Washington brought a cake decorated with 7 stick figures holding hands. Officer Rodriguez started a snowball fight that soon had everyone involved, dress clothes and all. That evening, after the party wound down and the last guest left, the family sat together in their living room. 7 hot chocolates with extra marshmallows, 7 hearts full of joy. "You know what this means?" James asked, looking at his daughters. "Officially, legally, forever his daughters." "What?" they asked in unison. "You're stuck with my terrible dad jokes for life now." They groaned and laughed, throwing marshmallows at him. The little one climbed into his lap, sticky with chocolate. "Tell us the story again," she said, "about how we became a family." "Well," James began, gathering them close, "it all started with a police call on a Tuesday evening. Later that night, James walked through the quiet house, checking on each sleeping daughter. In their rooms were the signs of their journey: adoption day balloons, new birth certificates, camera phones full of photos and videos from their special day. He paused at each doorway, watching them sleep, these 6 amazing girls who had changed his life completely. Tomorrow they would wake up knowing for certain what they had hoped for so long: that they were home, that they were loved, that they were forever family. 5 years passed like a beautiful blur. The house that once felt too big for one person now seemed to burst with life at every corner. Where there used to be silence, now laughter echoed through the halls, along with the occasional sister squabble and the constant rhythm of 6 different lives growing together. The oldest sister was packing for college. Her room was a mess of boxes and memories. Academic awards, basketball trophies, and countless family photos. She'd been accepted to several universities, but chose one just an hour away. Close enough for Sunday dinners, she'd explained, but far enough to be independent. James stood in her doorway, watching her fold clothes. "Remember when you wouldn't even let me make your lunch?" he teased. She smiled, holding up a worn photo, their first family picture, taken right after the adoption. "Remember when you tried to do our hair and made it look like we'd been electrocuted?" The twins were now high school basketball stars, their games drawing crowds from all over the district. James never missed a match, still wearing his custom jersey with both their numbers. They'd started a tradition of post-game ice cream, win or lose, where they'd break down every play while fighting over the last spoonful of hot fudge. The 9-year-old, now 14, had turned their basement into an art studio. Her paintings of their family hung everywhere, realistic portraits capturing their daily life. Her latest piece, titled "Love in Every Color," had won a national youth art competition. The 6-year-old, now 11, had inherited James's sense of justice. She'd started a club at school called Family is Family, where kids with different types of families could share their stories. "Being different isn't weird," she'd tell anyone who'd listen. "It's just different." And the littlest one, not so little anymore at 9, but still the family's heart. She kept her habit of leaving love notes around the house. James had a drawer full of them: crayon drawings, sticky notes, and carefully folded papers, all saying variations of "I love you, Daddy." Their aunt had become a regular part of their lives, visiting during holidays and sharing family stories. She brought photo albums and tales of relatives, helping the girls understand their roots while celebrating their new branches. James had retired from active police duty to focus on family advocacy. He traveled around the country, sharing their story and helping other families navigate transracial adoption. But his favorite moments were still at home, making 6 different school lunches, solving homework crises, and managing the controlled chaos of their morning routine. Their house had become a gathering place for the community. Sunday cookouts regularly turned into impromptu block parties. Mrs. Chen still brought dumplings. Mrs. Washington still did hair care lessons, though now she was teaching other adoptive parents too. The girl's biological mother had gotten clean and occasionally sent letters. James made sure the girls knew they could talk about her, look at old pictures, feel whatever they needed to feel. "Love multiplies," he'd tell them. "It doesn't divide." One evening, during their weekly family dinner, the oldest sister made an announcement. "I've chosen my major," she said. "Social work. I want to help other kids find their forever families." The table went quiet for a moment before erupting in cheers. James felt tears in his eyes, remembering that scared 14-year-old who'd once been too afraid to trust him. Later that night, as James did his usual rounds checking on everyone, he found all 6 girls piled onto the oldest's bed, looking at old photos and giggling. "Dad," they called out, "come tell us the story again." "Which one?" he asked, though he knew the answer. "The one about how we became a family." He squeezed onto the bed somehow, and they all shifted to make room. The littlest one tucked herself under his arm, just like she used to do when she was 4. "Well," he began, "it all started with a police call that changed everything. 5 years hadn't erased the challenges. They still got stares sometimes. People still asked questions. The girls still had moments of missing their birth family. But they'd learned that real family isn't about matching what's on the outside. It's about the love that grows on the inside." Their story had become more than just a tale of adoption. It was proof that courage comes in many forms. The courage to trust, to love, to change, to grow. It was evidence that family isn't defined by blood or color, but by the choice to love each other every single day. As James looked around at his daughters, strong, confident, loving young women, he realized that sometimes the biggest miracles come disguised as ordinary moments. And sometimes, the most beautiful families are the ones that nobody saw coming.